So good evening, students, colleagues, Professor Almanza. We start with the lecture, as the custom, with the evening prayer of the church, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father in heaven, you open the kingdom of heaven to those born again by water and the Holy Spirit. Increase the gift of love in us. May all who have been freed from sin in baptism receive all that you have promised. We ask it through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So welcome again all to this lecture, the seventh lecture this evening, especially Professor Almanza, who gives us this lecture, and students, colleagues who came, also the master students of epistemology and ethics are here. Yeah. I introduce the speaker this evening, Professor Ian Shelley Almanza was awarded summa cum laude honors for his PhD in philosophy as major in global studies here at our university, 2017. The title of his PhD is Migrant Transnationalism and Religious Transformation, Religious Faith and Practice Among Filipino Migrants, an anthropological approach focusing on Macau. But he has also many other degrees, licentiate in theology called STL from the Pontifical University of Santo Tomas, Manila, 2 master degrees, Master of Arts in major in Theology of Consecrated Life from an Institute for Consecrated Life in Asia, Quezon City, Philippines, Master of Arts, major in Pastoral Ministry, Ateneo de Manila, Quezon City, Philippines, and 2 bachelors, one in Theology, STP, from Ateneo, Manila, and one in Philosophy in St. Anthony Maria Claret College, Quezon City. He has been lecturing here many years, already. I found minutes from our faculty from 2007, I mean before the faculty actually existed. The minutes are written by Ian Almanza, minutes of 14 years ago. So we are thankful that you prepared this lecture this evening for us. The title Human Behavior and Natural Law Ethics. So we continue reflection on natural law ethics this evening. Of course, I forgot to mention all the publications of Professor Almanza. You have it on the website, especially related to migrant law ethics and pastoral. There are lectures given in Japan, I think, in Ho Chi Minh City. You can find it on the website. I also welcome the communication office again, the diocese, the record the lectures and put it on the net for our people. So welcome to this service. Also, I thank Maria Ley, especially to prepare and coordinate all these events. So the floor is now yours, Professor Almanza. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Franz, for the introduction, for giving them some clue about how old I am. All right, so this is natural law and human behavior. Now, I would want to start with setting the limits of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about 4 limits. So number 1 is that I will talk about natural law only in Aquinas, because natural law, there are many other philosophers who have written about natural law. And then I will talk about brain functions. Now, the brain is a very complicated thing, but I will just talk about those things that are directly relevant to moral decision making. The third one, I will talk about human behavior. I'm not going to talk about behavior of monkeys or of birds. I'm going to talk about human behavior. And finally, we will focus on human behavior and how human beings make moral decisions. So those of you who are familiar with Chinese, you know what this means, right? Also, the Japanese knows this, what this means. So it gives me permission to begin my talk. All right. So this is the sequence of my talk. I will begin with being human. And then I will talk about relevant brain functions, human social behavior, and then finally, at the end, we will talk about natural law and human behavior. So let's begin with being human. Now, I was tempted to talk about human nature, but I realized that while preparing this, it's not easy to talk about human nature, so it's probably easier to talk about being human. So I decided to talk about being human. So I will consider 3 points here. So number 1, animal. Number 2, what I call humankind. And number 3, it's complex. Right, so let's begin with animal. This might come as a shock to many of you, but we can make the argument that humans are a kind of animal, right? So let's look at the reason why. So in many instances, humans behave as non-human animals, in particular mammals, right? So you see there I said non-human animals, right? But so let's. So you see here it's a leopard, and what is it doing? It's yawning, right? It's yawning. Humans also yawn. Are we an animal or not? Scratching. Humans also scratch, right? Maybe we're not an animal. Stretching, right? So cat stretching, cat-like woman stretching. Let me see if this is going to play. Do you think that only humans dream? Those of you who have a dog, you probably know. How's it gonna play? Not working. There. It's dreaming. Okay? So just because we're dreaming, it doesn't mean we're not animals, because even animals dream, right? So let me give you some more examples. There's this something called Wellesley Effect. It was first discovered in a college called Wellesley College, which was an all-girls college. So they found out that all of these girls, they stayed in the same dormitory. After just a few weeks of staying together in the same dormitory, all of them had had their period more or less at the same time. And this is also has been studied, and it's also the same in mice, and in other mammals. So if you look at it, animals eat, sleep, pee and poo. We sneeze, we scratch, we mate, things like this. But not only these things. If you look at other animals, they have aggression. Humans also have aggression. They cooperate, like the chimpanzees, for example. If they want to raid the next village of chimpanzees, they can cooperate and go to war over there, and care for the young. All right. So anyway, the point I'm making is that there is a case to make that we are animals. Okay. So there is something about us that is related to being animal-like. But at the same time, we can also say that we are humankind. I put this in quotations because humans are the human kind of animals. This is in philosophy called tautology. It does not say anything, right? Because you're just saying the same thing that you're saying in the subject. But anyway, so allow me to explain what I mean by this one. So we are animals, but there are many ways by which we behave unlike other animals, especially mammals, right? So that's why we are the human kind of animal, not just an ordinary kind of animal, but the human kind. So for example, we are the only animal that checks what is our weight, right? No other animal does this. We are the only animal, let me check. Yeah, I'm still nervous. Why do we get nervous when we speak in front of people? So anyway, this is something that's very human. Sorry, this is me maybe after 15 years or 20 years. We're the only kind of animal that have sex, and then after we have sex, we talk about the sex, right? I know most of you on that because of sex. Okay, this is we are the only kind of animal that would pay for people to fight, right? And then when these people fight, we are the only animal that after fighting, we hug or we embrace the person who we have been fighting with. So it's very strange being human, right? So other examples of being the human kind of human. Okay, so I said when we get nervous, even if there was no threat to you were not going to kill me, right? But why do I get so nervous in front of you? I already said that. Oh, celibacy. Many of you here, right? I think we can say that we can make the case that this is humans can do it. Non-altruistic self-harm. It's another term for suicide, right? Okay, so what we're saying here is that there are many ways by which we are not the same as the mammals. So we are also not mammals in that sense. Now, the third point I want to make is that it's really complicated, right? It's complicated. When you look at human behavior, you have to take into consideration all of these things, so many different things. And we could say that being human is not that simple. It's not just about being an animal or not being an animal. It's so much more than that. And so we will try to unpack some of these things as we move along. So let's say, for example, when somebody gets angry, right? So let's look at the complex layers of this behavior. So he got angry. What happened seconds before that? We will see this, that his brain secreted a lot of testosterone. So it's a kind of hormone secreted by the brain that makes people become more aggressive. Hours before that, there was a buildup of cortisol. It's another kind of hormone. It's a stress hormone in his brain. Days before that, he had been listening to rock music, which is a kind of sensory stimuli, while writing his final paper in epistemology and ethics. And weeks before that, it had been hot and humid. Years before that, there was many foreigners from all over the world coming to Macau. I don't know if it has any effect. But decades before that, he was raised in a family with an angry father. While he was in the womb, there was some alcohol and some nicotine in there. And he received this particular set of genes, and we could say it so happened that humans also evolved this way. So there's so many layers to explaining human behavior. And so I am not going to pretend that I will be able to explain behavior the way that will help us understand totally what behavior is. But the point I'm making here is that being human is not simple. Okay, it's complicated, but we can say that, right? We behave in some ways like animals, and we behave in some ways not like animals. All right, so if you get offended by being called an animal, so let's just say we are biological beings, okay? But we are also more than that, right? So let's go to our next point, which is the relevant brain functions. So the main point we're trying to make here is that behavior flows through the brain. Now, I know that our bias is theology and philosophy, and we don't care about science, right? But we do not have a quarrel with science. Science probably has a quarrel with us, but let's say we don't have a quarrel with science, so let's see what science has to say about how and why we behave the way that we do. So in order to do that, we have to consider the brain. So I'm going to talk about 4 points in this section. So number 1, automaticity, emotion, cognition. Number 2, the 2 nervous systems. Number 3, anxiety, fear, aggression. Number 4, cognition, reason, and will. Now there's so many more that we can talk about here. I did not talk about guilt. I did not talk about shame. I did not talk about love, okay? Because we don't have time for that. So let me just choose these 4, all right? So let's start with automaticity, emotion, and cognition. All right. So the idea behind this is that the human brain has, in general, 3 layers. And Paul MacLean called it the triune brain. So that it's not too offensive to the religious people, I'm not going to use triune brain because it's like, oh, you're saying the brain is like the Trinity. No, but anyway, it has three main areas. So you could say this part is called they sometimes, most of the time it's called reptilian brain. So it's that kind like the reptiles. Example of a reptile is a crocodile, a lizard, a snake, all right? So this is like the kind of part of the brain that has something to do more or less with our automatic functions of the body. Now, the limbic system, they say, is something that came about with the advent of the mammals. So here you have the emotions. And then you have the neocortex, okay, this one, which is more or less unique to human beings. All right, so I call it, instead of triune brain, I call it tripartite brain, all right? So you have the brainstem, the limbic system, and then the neocortex. So the brainstem has something to do with automaticity. I will explain to you what this means. Limbic system has something to do with emotion, while the neocortex has something to do with cognition. So, for example, automatic, right? So our body temperature, when you exert effort and then you sweat, when you're hungry, when you're sleepy, the rate of your heart, all of these are controlled by the brainstem, okay, or the reptilian brain. Things like anxiety, stress, fear, anger, guilt, shame, attachment, empathy, love, all of these things are the part where you have the limbic system. Sensory processing, when we see things, when we hear things, or when we taste things, this happens in the neocortex. Memory storage, voluntary muscle movement. So when I say I want to do like this to my fingers, I'm using my neocortex, or something like this, right? I'm using my neocortex. Voluntary muscle movement, okay? Language is there. Executive decisions, I'm going to talk about that a little more later on. Philosophy is here. That's why you cannot philosophize with emotions. Morality. Now, morality is a little between these two. But anyway, I put it in here, okay? Because when we make moral decisions, this is where it happens. All right. Now, it's also important to talk about 2 nervous systems. So in the brain, or in our body, we have 2 nervous systems. So one is called the sympathetic nervous system. So just to make it short, we call it SNS. There's the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is related to arousal or excitation, while the parasympathetic nervous system is related to calmness or relaxation. So for example, they say the 4 Fs. It's actually not 4 Fs, but you have 4F plus an S over there. So S stands for sex, all right? So fear, fawn is like when you freeze because you cannot run away or you cannot fight back. Fight, flight, all right? Sex. This has something to do with the sympathetic nervous system. I call this pets. When you experience peace, equanimity, tranquility, serenity, all of this mean the same thing, all right? So when you're calm, this is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the SNS speeds up the heart. So just at the beginning of this lecture, my SNS was really working. My heart was beating this fast. And so I need now the PNS to tell myself, calm down, right? Nobody's going to eat you, all right? So this one slows the heart down. So you can think about when you work out in the gym or when you do Kung Fu, that's the sympathetic nervous system. When you do yoga or meditation, and this is the reason why many of you are very peaceful and calm because you pray every day. So prayer is a kind of PNS, all right? So just imagine this, okay? So this is SNS. When you do things like this, you activate the sympathetic nervous system. When you do something like this, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so that is to summarize it. Now, it is important to talk about this because this has a very strong influence on how we behave, right? So you could say, depending on how hard or how fast your heart beats, it will influence what decision you're going to make. All right, let's look at anxiety, fear, and aggression. And let me introduce you to a part of the brain, and that part of the brain is called amygdala. Okay, so this is a very important part of the brain, and it is found in the limbic system. And if you remember, the limbic system has something to do with our emotions. Okay. So the amygdala plays a role in social and emotional decision making. So when we make decisions in social interaction and also in how we feel, this is the amygdala plays a role in that. So for example, when you feel these feelings, right? Anxiety, fear, and aggression, these all are found, you could say, are mediated through the amygdala. So for example, when you're anxious about your social standing, in the Faculty of Religious Studies, what is my position here is like who is smarter than me and who is not smarter than me. That is the amygdala, all right? Social conformity. How should I wear my hair, right? Or should I get a tattoo or not? If a tattoo is more or less accepted in your society, it's okay. But if in your society people look down on people with tattoo, this is the amygdala working there, okay? Phobia and learned fear, what's the difference? Phobia is that you don't know you're born with it. You have not been bitten by a snake, but why are you afraid of a snake, right? So it's phobia. Now there's kind of fear whereas we learn the kind of, it's learned fear. So for example, if you ride the same bus every day, and then you see the same driver who has been like driving really badly, you learn that I will not ride on this bus because I'm afraid that this bus driver will get me into an accident. So you learn it, right? Okay, so that is in the amygdala. Distrust and vigilance in social situations. So right now, right here, can I trust this person? Is this person is this person honest, or is this person gossip? This, when we distrust or when we are careful or vigilant in social situations, it is the amygdala that is responsible for that. How about pain? Pain can also be a trigger for the amygdala. So pain is a main trigger for fear or aggression. So sometimes when you are afraid, because you're afraid because it's going to be painful, right? or you are afraid because you know that you might get into a conflict. Okay, but it's quite interesting that for the amygdala, what is actually activates the amygdala is not the pain itself, but unpredictable pain. When you're trying to anticipate some kind of pain. And this is also why when you feel anxious, sometimes we don't know, why am I anxious, right? It's because it's your amygdala trying to be vigilant because something wrong might happen, okay? So that is the amygdala. Now in terms of pleasure, pleasure also can trigger the amygdala. So the amygdala activates when it anticipates a potential pleasure, not the experience of pleasure itself. So it's just enough to think about it. Think about a very delicious donut, your amygdala is already activating, all right. Now, it's also interesting to see that the pleasure can also come from being, expecting anxiety, fear, or anger about the possibility of the reward, okay? But the reward may or may not come, and so therefore you can have these sorts of feelings while you are anticipating. So this is the kind of pleasure sometimes that we get from the activation of the amygdala. So we can say that aggression, or you can say pain, and sex, which is associated with pleasure, they trigger the sympathetic nervous system. So, when you're really angry or when people are sexually aroused, the sympathetic nervous system starts to activate. So as I said, this has a very strong influence on how we decide to behave. Now, what about cognition, reason, and will? What about when we try to understand things, or when we use our reason, or when you don't want to get out of bed, but you can, right? So that is in the frontal cortex. Okay, so if you recall, all of this is the cortex, but right here in front is the frontal cortex. Now, in terms of evolution, even though you might be skeptical about evolution, let's just say that evolution is real. In evolution, the frontal cortex is you could say, the youngest part of the brain, the youngest part to evolve. So organizing knowledge is in this area, initiating action after a decision, right? So if I tell myself, can you do that with your hand? So my frontal cortex will say, okay, do it, and I'll do this, all right? Long-term planning, gratification postponement, reining in impulsivity, like you just do it because you want to do it. Emotion regulation, like when you're feeling depressed, can you still get out of that depression? Or when you're so happy and you want to shout, can you control yourself not to shout? All right, so this is emotion regulation. Altruism, like doing good to others without expecting anything in return. All of this are capabilities of the frontal cortex. Now, this is central to what we were talking about today. The frontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Okay, so try to remember that. We will talk about, this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Now, in the frontal cortex, there is a place called prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is right here in front. And this is the youngest part of the brain. And this is also the reason why only humans have this one. Or you could say that our prefrontal cortex is the most developed among all animals. Now, what we call it PFC, okay? PFC, prefrontal cortex. What are the functions of the prefrontal cortex? Working memory. Like, for example, you want to after 25 years, it reveals how old I am, but anyway, so I remember my girlfriend from before, and then let's say I still remember her phone number, right? And then I remember, oh, it's in the Philippines, so I have to use the number 63, which is the area code, country code. And then, oh, the area code in my hometown is 74, something like that. So when you combine all of these memory items together, you are using your working memory. Focusing on a task, right? So for example, when you're cutting the vegetables, right? You're focusing on it so that you do not cut yourself. You're using your prefrontal cortex. Attention to detail. You need to get a taxi. What do you look for? You look at does it have the green light? Is it green light, right? Is it flashing the light so that I don't need to look for all of the taxis? I just need a taxi with a flashing sign. Attention to detail. That's PFC. This is the executive function. So let's say I tell you, oh, can you buy these 10 items in the supermarket? Okay, so tomato, ketchup, meat, and blah, 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 whatever. So what you're going to do is you try to, if it's too many items, like 15 items, and then you try to memorize it, you organize it. Okay, so that you look for patterns, and then you choose a strategic action on how you're going to implement it. Categorical thinking. Okay, so which ones are mammals, which ones are reptiles, which ones are birds? We do this with our prefrontal cortex. And this is quite important to our topic, aiding underdog outcomes. What this means is that we will see later on that in many instances, the prefrontal cortex has to negotiate with the amygdala. Okay, because when we feel something, we want to do it. But sometimes it's not the right thing to do, right? And so the prefrontal cortex will say, don't do that. So there are times wherein the emotions are really so strong that you could say, oh, the emotions are going to win. But it's the PFC that is also responsible for providing a fighting chance for some inhibitory neurons, meaning neurons that will prevent you from acting, okay? So that the emotions will not always prevail, okay? So these are the functions of the prefrontal cortex. We can call this also the decider. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that makes the decision. Right. So normally the decider has to choose between, most of the time, okay, the decision is about emotion-driven versus cognition-driven, right? So something that is emotional as compared to something that is rational, right? So we make many of these decisions. So for example, USJ or UM, right? So it is, by the way, this is not USJ, it's University of St. John and University of Mary, right? So, where am I going? This is the decider is the prefrontal cortex. Work on it later or work on it now. Another term for this is procrastination, right? So that's actually procrastination is not about laziness. It's about fear. So remember the amygdala, fear, anxiety, right? So the amygdala is afraid that you will fail, and so therefore, oh, I cannot work on this right now. I'll do it tomorrow. You cannot do it now because your amygdala is telling you you're going to fail, you know, so it makes you afraid, so you don't do it. But the decider will say, work on it now, all right? Speak up or shut up. No? So there are times when you know something is wrong. But if you speak up, you might lose your job, right? Or you might be ostracized by society. It's the PFC that makes it possible for you to speak up. Should be here. Oh, no, wrong example. So wrong example. When you want to say something about a person, not nice, right? Like, oh, you're fat. You became too fat now, or something like that, right? Would you shut up instead? Wrong example. Okay. React or ignore, right? So when somebody say, "Hey, why you so ugly?" and then would you want to react, or would you just want to ignore this function of the PFC? I'm going to avenge, or am I going to forgive, right? So this is what the decider has to do. And I have news for you. By the way, the PFC is not fully developed until you reach your mid-20s. So when you're 25, 26, 27, your PFC is fully developed. This is the reason why adolescents, like many of you here, have a lot of trouble with the amygdala, because anyway, but it's possible. It's possible to still make the decider win, okay? So that is the prefrontal cortex. So basically what we have said here is that behavior flows through the brain, all right? We go to our third point, human social behavior. I'm going to talk about 4 points here. So number 1, we will look at socially complex species. Number 2, we will look at prosocial and antisocial behavior. Number 3, the biology of psychology. And then number 4, we'll try to think of the question, is there good and is there evil? Okay. So first, let's start with socially complex species. And I need you to learn one word here, and it's called neurons, okay, or neuron. Now, neurons is basically the word for brain cells, okay, so the cells in the brain. Now, there are different kinds of neurons. I'm going to show you here one kind of neuron, which is called von Economo neurons, or they are also called spindle neurons, right? Now, it's not important for you to memorize how they look like, but that's a spindle. That's why they're also called spindle neurons, okay? Now, von Economo neurons are found only in the most socially complex of animals, right? And you can count them with your fingers. Have any idea? The most socially complex animals, aside from human beings. A little higher than monkey. Okay, chimpanzee would be primates. Okay, chimpanzees or orangutans, all right? Whales, dolphins, elephants, and if you don't want humans to be included in the primates, so humans, all right? So these are the ones with von Economo neurons. So what is special about this kind of neurons? These neurons are considered to be essential in social behavior and are found in only 2 areas of the frontal cortex. What we should understand here is that in order for us to live with, for example, other humans, or with chimpanzees with other chimpanzees, your brain has to work quite hard because you have to get along with them, and it takes a lot of effort. So that's why it's special to socially complex animals, all right? So socially complex species. Now, in the human brain, the von Economo neurons are found in only 2 areas in the frontal cortex. So it can be found in the insula. I'm going to talk about this more later on, and in the anterior cingulate. No need to memorize these places. But anyway, insula is the area that mediates the feeling of disgust. Anterior cingulate is that area that mediates the feeling of empathy. All right. So just to show you where the anterior cingulate is, it's somewhere here, okay? So it's in contact with the limbic system. So we can talk about prosocial and antisocial behavior. Because morality, if you really think about it, it's mostly social. Right? So morality is try to do these things alone. Aggression, violence, compassion, empathy, sympathy, competition, cooperation, altruism. All of these things are about morality, and mostly they are something about social interaction. Okay? You cannot do these things alone, or can you? Envy. Okay, we have a native German speaker. Father, could you explain to them what Schadenfreude means?
Yeah, to enjoy when somebody suffers something or makes a mistake and so. Schadenfreude.
Yeah. Okay, so Schadenfreude is like when you feel some kind of pleasure at the misfortune of other people, right? So for example, when the former guy in the United States lost the election, if you really don't like him, you feel a Schadenfreude. All right, so it's like, yes. So try to do that alone, you cannot. Forgiveness. Spite. Spite is like when you want to do something, when you want to annoy another person, or you want to make him angry. That's spite, okay? Reconciliation, revenge, reciprocity, love, right? So you would see that all of these things are mostly social. So morality is actually mostly social. Let me give you another, so that's why we can talk about, when we talk about morality, we can talk about antisocial behavior and pro-social behavior. Now, antisocial behavior in general, let's just put it generally, has something to do with harming or hurting others, while pro-social is something that caring or wanting the good for others. Now, most of human behavior that carry moral weight are directed toward other humans. That's why morality is mostly social. And let's just mention here that we utilize the frontal cortex to do the harder, and most of the time the pro-social thing is the harder thing to do, right? So pro-social thing is in social context. So for example, we sit up straight and pretend to listen to our boring professor, right? It's not easy to do, but it's the pro-social thing to do, right? We don't make upfront sexual advances to humans that we fantasize about, all right? It's the pro-social thing to do. We inhibit ourselves from hitting, you haven't experienced this yet because most of you haven't worked, but from hitting our very annoying coworker, yeah. So it's a pro-social thing to do. It's not easy to do. All right, so now let's talk about the biology of psychology. What I want to say is that psychological states, so when you are depressed, when you're happy, when you are angry, okay, or when you are at peace, these psychological states are also biological states, right? Oh, sorry. Do you know what this is? Okay, so in my country it's called balut. In Vietnam, what is it called? Whatever, okay. So okay, now for those people who don't like this or who are not familiar with this, can you notice what's happening to yourself? Can you feel that your mouth starts to do something like this and like you want to close your nose, right? So we call it disgusting. It's disgusting, right? Now, let's look at this idea of disgust, because my point here is I want to show you that your psychological state has a biological foundation, okay? Now, so this is when we talk about the insula. Remember, it is also where we find the von Economo neurons. So insula is related to gustatory disgust, meaning disgust that you feel from the stomach, like that balut, depending, okay, for me, I really love it, but for most of you, probably it's like disgusting. It's the same for the durian. For some people, it's disgusting. So that's, durian is both gustatory here and then olfactory here, okay? So you smell it and then you feel it in the gut. So, strangely, the gut and the brain communicate, because it has been found that there are neurons in the gut. Okay, so we would think that neurons are only found in the brain because they are brain cells, but there are neurons in the gut. And so therefore, anyway, the point here is that we are looking at the biology of our psychological behavior. So you see this face, all right? So it's a face of disgust. So you see your mouth and then your nose, like. It can also have, you can also have this face not only with food or not only with smell, but also with, we call it moral disgust. So some people are disgusting because they have disgusting behavior. Okay? So that's why, I don't know if you know the movie Inside Out. So she is one of the characters, so you see her face, stay away from me, that's disgust, all right? So let's look at a moral example. I don't know if you would consider smoking a moral issue, okay, but for those of you who are non-smokers, it's disgusting, okay? Or I don't know if you feel the same way about people who smoke, okay? So we feel disgust when we see people violate social norms, right? So for example, when somebody, do you know paidoy? Yeah, so fall in line, right? When somebody does not fall in line, paidoy ah, right? So you say they violate the social norms. A disgusting person, fall in line, right? Stigmatized individuals, right? Drug addict, alcoholic, right? Is it right or wrong to be stigmatized, to be disgusted by these people? Anyway, it's a moral problem. All right. How we feel towards others. So when we're talking about others here, people who are not the same as us. So for example, the reason there is a strong relationship between disgust, let's say in the United States, if you're a Republican, you find the Democrats disgusting. And if you're a Democrat, you find the Republicans disgusting. Or if you do not like homosexuals, and you see homosexuals, you can feel disgust. So because they are different from you, and it's also the same thing for other people. Okay, so I don't know, like people from Australia might find people from New Zealand disgusting. I'm not so sure, but anyway. So, but anyway, when we're talking about others. So that's why there is this idea called us versus them. And this, you can say, also has its roots in disgust. Probably the correct term is we versus they. But anyway, any native English speaker? Nobody. So let me tell you something which is, we have a problem in Myanmar right now, right? This happened in my country back in 1986. We were going against our dictator, and people went to the streets. But what is different during that situation and the situation in Myanmar, I think, in my opinion, is that we had a weaker, you could say, a weaker distinction between others. So our military probably saw the ordinary people as one of them, not different from them. Okay, so something like this. So you see what happened there. We were also like fighting against the tanks, and we were giving flowers to the soldiers. So you see here flowers over there, right? And even the sisters. So I saw some video that in Myanmar there was one sister who was always like talking to the soldiers, right? Doesn't work. In Philippines, it worked, okay? So it's more complicated than that, but probably one of the factors probably is that the soldiers saw that the people are one of them. We are not different. We are the same. So anyway, this is a digression. So let's look at cognition versus emotion. The question here is that, is thought really totally different from emotion? Okay. So let's, in order to help us understand this, let's consider two regions of the decider. Remember, the decider is the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, right? So it's not important, but we just need the terms. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So you would see that this one is quite far away from the limbic system, and this one is actually connected to the limbic system, right? So there's like a direct connection there. So what is the difference between the two? The DLPFC is kind of like the decider of deciders. This is like that part of the brain that is the most rational, the most cognitive, the utilitarian. Doesn't matter what you feel, right? Doesn't matter what you feel. This is how it should work. The unsentimental part of the PFC. Now, the ventromedial PFC is related to the impact of emotion on decision making. So you could say it's kind of emotional part of the frontal cortex. Now, if you do not have the VMPFC, you don't have the gut feeling. And you will realize that when you do not have gut feelings, it's very difficult for you to make a decision. Okay, so the point that we're trying to make here, okay, so for example, the DLPFC is responsible for things like doing the harder thing, or when you delay your gratification for a bigger reward later, right? So this is something that is not emotional. You have to put your reason and your cognition to be able to do this. Now, when you, for example, when you win something, or when your team wins something, this is lights up, okay? Or when you listen to wonderful music, this lights up. All right. So these two regions of the decider can help us see the connection between emotion and cognition. So it has been found that people with VMPFC damage, okay, by injury or by disease, do not only have trouble making decisions, but they also make bad decisions. So the idea there is that because you cannot feel it in your gut, what you know, you cannot make the right decision, okay? So without a VMPFC, you know the meaning cognitively, you know the meaning of negative feedback, but you don't know the feeling of it in your gut, and so you do not change your behavior, right? And this is the reason also why, like, most of the time we tell ourselves, I know it, okay? But I just don't know how to make the decision. So this is because of that. Okay. Now, ultimately, the decisions that we make are the ones that feel good for us. Okay, so what we're trying to show here is that there is actually a very strong connection between your cognition and your emotion, right? But it does not mean that they are always moral. Okay, so we will look at this. Okay, so that's why this author, his neuroscientist also, he wrote Descartes' error. Okay, emotion, reason, and the human brain, because Descartes made the dualism between thought and emotion. Okay, so he says that there is no dichotomy between thought and emotion. Anyway, let's just say that when we're talking about the biology of psychology, psychological states are also biological states. Now, good versus evil. Are there good acts and evil acts? So let's think about farting, okay? So it's farting, is it right or is it wrong? Okay. Farting alone in your bedroom, right or wrong? Okay. Farting at your dog, is it right or wrong? Farting at a plant, is it right or wrong? Farting inside a packed elevator, is it right or wrong? What about you fart inside the elevator but you're alone? Is it right or wrong? All right? Or when you fart in bed with your wife of 25 years, right? Is it right or wrong? So it's a trivial example, farting. But also let's try anger. Okay? Is it wrong to get angry? If you think about it, there are many instances where we should get angry. Okay, so when somebody invades your land, you do not say, oh, welcome, 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 right? You should get angry. Okay, okay, let's do something positive, cooperation. Okay, is cooperation good or is it bad? Is it right or is it wrong? My students always tell me, we're not cheating, we're cooperating. Right? So isn't it supposed to be good? Okay. So the idea here is that, let's have another example, aggression. Okay? If you really think about it, we really don't hate aggression itself. Okay? Because but we do hate the wrong kind of aggression. Right? So when the former guy who was a bully is aggressive, it's so wrong. Right? But when somebody punches that former guy who was a bully, punches him in the face, so right, right? So therefore what we're saying here is that, more examples. So aggression, okay, already cooperation, okay, kissing, so there are times when it's acceptable to kiss, there are times when it's not acceptable to kiss, okay? So it is context that makes us perceive whether an act is acceptable or unacceptable. So we can question whether there are good acts or evil acts, or should we reconsider and say instead of good acts and evil acts, let's say that we behave our best, but we can also behave our worst. Okay. Maybe I'll go 5 minutes over time. All right, so now let's move on to natural law and human behavior. So first we'll consider Aquinas. We'll look at this inhibition and disinhibition. We will look at consent, and then we will look at consent as disinhibition. So let's start with Aquinas. So Aquinas says that there are 4 kinds of law. Okay, so the eternal law, this is laws that govern the universe. The human law created by people, discovered through reason. Divine law, law of God revealed to humans. This is what we are going to talk about here. Okay, the natural law. So these are the precepts of the eternal law that govern the behavior of beings possessing reason and free will. So in short, human beings. Now, one thing we can say about Aquinas is that he says the rule of reason over our other powers. Right? So we have here a quotation from the Summa. As in man, I put there humans to include the women, reason rules and commands the other powers, so all the natural inclinations belonging to the other powers must needs be directed according to reason. Wherefore it is universally right for all humans that all their inclinations should be directed according to reason. So basically what he's saying is that reason should govern our actions. Now, reason tells us that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Again from the Summa. Hence, this is the first precept of law, that good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts of the natural law are based upon this, so that whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good belongs to the precepts of the natural law as something to be done or avoided. In short, it's reason that tells us to pursue the good and avoid the bad. Okay. So, in short, reason directs us to do good and avoid evil. It's very related to the prefrontal cortex. Okay. Now, we'll talk about the idea of inhibition and disinhibition. Now, moral decisions are about inhibition and disinhibition. So you say, control yourself, right? It's something about morality. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Okay, it's about morality. You'll go to hell, all right? So all of this have successfully inhibit our behavior. So inhibition, right? So let me give you more examples of inhibition. So for example, you inhibit yourself from being part of a hiring committee when one of the job applicants is your nephew, right? Moral. I should not use my research grant to pay my mother to be my research assistant. It's wrong, right? So I inhibit myself. Surgeons do not perform surgery on their family members because they are so emotionally involved in it, they cannot perform the surgery properly. Let's consider this other. I don't care what others think. Everybody is doing it anyway. What were you thinking? I wasn't, right? So these has something to do with disinhibition. When we put down the walls of control. So disinhibition. All right. Well, if you're here in Macau and you walk the dog and then your dog is so cute, what do people say? Right? So for those who are not Chinese, it means, okay, you mama, so, can I touch? All right. So when you see something so cute, you cannot inhibit yourself, right? So anyway, that's just a joke. All right, so let's go back to the prefrontal cortex. This inhibition is related to the silencing or the diminished influence of the frontal cortex. Because remember, the frontal cortex is the decider, and normally the frontal cortex decides from cognition, not from emotion. All right. So, instances of the reduced influence of the frontal cortex. For example, when you're dreaming, that's why your dreams are so weird, right? There's no reason in your dreams because the frontal cortex is not involved, right? So you can dream about anything. No control. There's no controller. Falling in love, right? When you fall in love, I don't care if it's wrong or right. I care that I love you. So it doesn't matter if it's wrong. The breakdown of the frontal influence of the frontal cortex. Okay, orgasm. Let's just keep it short. Sociopaths. Okay, sociopaths are those people who they kill people not because out of revenge or something, but just because it's precise or something like this, or it's an art or something like this. So that means that there is something wrong with the frontal cortex. All right. Now, social and behavioral disinhibition. So let me just talk about these three things. So when you have injury or disease in the frontal cortex, we see people stealing, being more aggressive, hypersexuality, compulsive gambling. So this is dysfunction. Another thing that can influence our disinhibition is cognitive load. So I'll talk about cognitive load in a little while. You become less pro-social, you have less self-control, you have less concern about fairness, for example. And we'll talk about habits. Habits has something to do with automaticity. When something that is difficult at the beginning becomes automatic, and it's already a kind of disinhibition. Now, let's talk about cognitive load. Okay, cognitive load versus the will. So what do we mean by cognitive load? Cognitive load is the total mental effort it takes to process information related to reasoning and decision making, right? Now, the decider can get exhausted. Your prefrontal cortex can get exhausted because the negotiation between your limbic system and your prefrontal frontal cortex requires a lot of energy. So, you know, like those they say that the reason why people behave this way, like a CEO, is not because they're powerful, but it's because that they don't have time. You know, that there's so much on their head, there's so much that they need to consider. They have so much cognitive load, so they cannot care about other people anymore. Right? So it's too much cognitive load. When your professor has no pen, try to understand him. Maybe he has too much cognitive load, right? Okay, so so what happens is that when you have heavy cognitive load, it diminishes your willpower. Okay, your prefrontal cortex does not have enough power to tell the limbic system that's wrong. Okay, it's not easy anymore. So we need habits and will. Habitual behavior mostly resides in the area of automaticity. Remember the automatic, this is the brainstem, that when it's automatic, so for example, when you're always kind, this is the reason why, this is the point of virtue ethics, all right? When you're always kind, when you're always helpful, when you're always honest, when through many years you have practiced patience, what happens is that this becomes kind of like automatic for you. It's habitual, so you don't need too much prefrontal help of the prefrontal cortex for you to be able to do this automatically. So therefore, it's also a kind of disinhibition. So the decider does not need to use much willpower for habitual behavior. But on the other hand, the decider has to intervene in order to inhibit habitual behavior. Okay? All right. So remember, the frontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. All right. Can I have how many more minutes, Father? Is it okay? All right. So consent. Consent is a matter of reason with regard to action. So let's go to Thomas Aquinas. He says, consent implies a judgment about the thing to which consent is given. Right? So you have a judgment. For just as the speculative reason judges and delivers its sentence about intelligible matters, so the practical reason judges and pronounces sentence on matters of action. Okay, so we have here consent. Another definition of consent here. This is a little bit more difficult to pack. Okay, so the higher reason is said to consent from the very fact that it fails to direct the human act according to the divine law, whether or not it adverts to the eternal law. So what he is saying here is that if you also fail to act according to the divine law, that's also consent, right? So, for if it thinks of God's law, it holds it in actual contempt. And if not, it neglects it by a kind of omission. So therefore, if you do something which is against the law of God, it is a kind of consent, which is a failure, okay? Consent as a failure. And that is what I would call later on as inhibitive consent. So finally, therefore, the consent to a sinful act always proceeds from the higher reason, because as Augustine says, the mind cannot effectively decide on the commission of a sin unless by its consent, whereby it wields its sovereign power over moving the members to action or of restraining them from action. It becomes the servant or slave of the evil deed. So the point I'm trying to make here is that consent can also be considered as failure of restraint. And so we come to the final point, consent as disinhibition. So the frontal cortex and the limbic system stimulate or inhibit each other, but as we have seen, it is the frontal cortex that is the final decider. So this is the process, right? The prefrontal cortex decides, it relates it to the frontal cortex, it relates it to the premotor cortex, it relates it to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex directs the muscles, and you have behavior. Okay? So when the prefrontal cortex already has made the decision, the body, through the movement of the muscles, will act. Okay. Now, what is consent as disinhibition? So we could say that consent in neurobiological terms happens once the prefrontal cortex directs the muscles to action. All right. Acts that we consider immoral, let's say, for example, you harm somebody or you hurt somebody, involve the consent of the decider. What we mean by the decider here is the prefrontal cortex. Consent of the decider to emotions arising from the limbic system that are considered immoral. Okay, so for example, if your limbic system is wanting you to exact revenge, right? So it's something that is emotional. And then you consent to that, right? So therefore, that makes your consent immoral. So when the frontal cortex consents, it disinhibits itself from resistance to the limbic system. So we could say that your consent is the breakdown of your resistance, the breakdown of your inhibition. It's disinhibition. So when you disinhibit, you are giving consent, and you are giving consent to the limbic system. Okay, the frontal cortex gives. So that's why I would call this disinhibitive consent. If you're English, you would understand what this means. Oxymoron means it's like a contradictory. It contradicts its own name, right? So you cannot be disinhibitive and consensual at the same time. But anyway, so allowing the limbic system to, you could say, to veto the decider is a form of disinhibitive consent. All right, and so therefore, so from the perspective of natural law, instances of immoral acts occur when the reason or the will fails by consenting through disinhibition. Right. So anyway, I finished with this. Consent can both be the success and the failure of reason or of will. So that's it. Thank you.